Yes, you mentioned that initially, I guess the Polish communist regime and the Soviet Ukrainian regime had in mind to deport the Lemko, or the Ukrainians, from the southern territory to west, well, originally to eastern Ukraine. That didn't work, so they started settling them at the western border regions, but that didn't work either, and that's why in the end they were shipped to the former German territories. And the reason for this was that there was an intense lack of housing. And I just wanted to say from personal experiences and from talking to many relatives over many years that the reason for the lack of housing was because that so many Soviet soldiers, so many from Russia and many other republics that were now part of the Soviet structural and administrative machinery settled in those areas. And that was the primary reason for the lack of housing. And that's who the current Ukrainians have problems with still, because those people still live there in the better houses.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for this question. First, I just want to precise that the last wave, which was this wave of deportation, it was not because the lack of houses. It was because the deportation to the western side, the new western side of Poland. It was because the border between Ukraine and Poland was totally closed at that time.
Oh, okay.
So they...
So she's referring to the last phase of the previous phase. The people from San region moved.
Yeah, okay. Yes, you are right. A lot of soldiers were settled in all the borderlands region of the new western borderland regions of the Soviet Union, but they were settled mostly in towns, and I referred here in the landscapes. So people who were expelled arrived in rural regions of Ukraine, and there was a big problem of houses.
We have a question over here. The woman next to Ivan, your name's been up for a long time. Hi, thank you. Eilish Hart, University of Toronto. So I have a question for Kathleen. I wanted to ask you, since you said there's kind of a disparity between sources in terms of like the memory of these forced population transfers in Poland versus Ukraine. So I was wondering if you could kind of speak to how, like, what kind of work is being done to kind of recover the social history of these events. I mean, obviously your book would fit into that, but I was wondering how, what is being done to kind of recover the Ukrainian side of how these events took place and how people experienced them. Thanks.
Yes, I was talking about the discrepancy of testimonies between the Polish population and the Ukrainian ones. But if we refer to the state sources, of course, the Soviet and the Soviet-Ukrainian sources about the history of the history of population displacement of Ukrainian are much more detailed and much more documented than from the Polish side. And here you see also the discrepancy of states, because you know the new Poland was start from almost nothing. This famous Lublin committee start with about 20 people and with nothing. So it depends what you are talking about. If you are talking about sources, and I think you can say more about the Ukrainian population, you have more also you have more evidences, quantitative data about them than for the Poles of Ukraine.
We have time for one last question.
Catherine, I have a question for you. I'm very glad that we are talking about a more complicated picture of the region in that period, and specifically about maybe state forced deportations, right? Because that's the story that's kind of left behind in many accounts, right? And my question is, you spoke here about the identities of Lemkos, right? And my question for you is whether the story of identities of people who were removed from this both sides of the border, if they were a little bit more complicated, if you noticed anything like that. And what I mean is that very often these identities were imposed on people by the state authorities, by the Polish authorities, and by the Ukrainian Soviet authorities, designating them to be Poles or designating them to be Ukrainians, and kind of moving them, whereas people, in fact, they were not so polarized on the issue of their identity, especially in the south and around the Sound there.
Thank you. You know, about identities, I think you can talk without end on this question. I want just to take one example about the people of this the Ukrainian of the region of Lublin, who first decided indeed to go to Ukraine, and who were sent to the central region of Ukraine. There they experimented a terrible situation, and they were welcome as Polak and as Kulak in region where people were very poor, where they experimented the famine and so on. So what did these people? They decided to try to come back to Poland, and to come back to Poland because you know there was this question of papers. It was not easy. And what did they do? They presented themselves as Poles. When starts this huge wave, the first huge wave of departure of Poles from Ukraine, so they just said that they were Poles, and it was the way they used to come back to Poland. And also you can see a big traffic between Poles who were on the point to be evacuated and who indeed sold their papers to Ukrainians who were already evacuated and wanted to come back, and so on. And so it's a good example to show you to which extent the question of identity was very often a very pragmatic question. And of course, in all this region of borderlands, you can see the volatility of this identity all during the war and even before. So.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have to draw the panel to a close. So thanks to Miroslav, to Catherine, to Mehil.